Hello, thanks for joining me once again, looking at the wacky world of Synapse Analytics. And there's 2 whole months of news and updates we need to go through because I've been busy. I've been out of the country. It's been a lot recently. I mean, just ask the UK government. Anyway, so there's lots of things for us to talk to. So we're going to talk about what happened in May 2022. I know that feels like a long time ago. And there's a whole bunch of changes that went in. We've got some Azure Data Explorer stuff. We've got some integration stuff. We've got some Sparky stuff. And then we'll have a look at the June 2022 updates as well. And we've got more of the same. Lots of different little bits and features. And some very, very useful things if you're working on things like POCs. Some useful guidance and white papers. And not just the techie stuff. So we'll be taking a look through those things as per usual. And yeah, let me know what you think. As usual, don't forget to like and subscribe if you are new around here. This is what we do. We talk about Synapse, we talk about Databricks, we talk about all of the nerdy data stuff in the land of Azure. Right, go have a look at stuff. So as per usual, I've got the release notes up and we're going to have a step through. So again, Synapse team is still doing their monthly updates, which is great hearing it from their mouths, how they're explaining the updates, how they're hearing how things are going. So I do suggest that you have a look through. The things that we're going to do. Number 1, we'll talk about the Synapse Influencer Program. Kind of like a bit more of a chance to kind of kickstart the community and get people more involved talking about Synapse. We'll have a look at that. We've got some changes on the SQL side, changes on the Spark side. Always interesting. You know I love Spark. A few Data Explorer things that we'll have a quick step through. Some new things going into mapping data flows. So the data integration side of the Synapse fence. And then a little mention of Synapse Link for SQL, although we did talk about that during build, which again feels like months ago, but it was, but this is from months ago, so you know. Fine. Okay, first things first, the Synapse Influencer Program. Now this is a thing that the Synapse team have put together to essentially try and reward people, trying to gamify the putting out of content and the engaging with the Synapse community. So you've got 3 different levels of Synapse Influencer. You got the people who are just kind of generally engaging, the people who are putting out a blog series here or there, and the people that are putting out videos and running conferences and doing all sorts of events. Loads of different ways to get involved. And basically they're asking you to kind of self-certify and say, hey, I am one of those. And then just keep up the expected amount of discourse, the expected amount of content, the expected amount of things. In return, they're doing some Synapse Influencer only events, some talks, some Ask the Experts, and various different things just to try and reward that community, to try and bring people together as Synapse users to try and push that forward. So if you are interested, and I'm assuming you are because you're watching this video, then do get involved with the influencer community. I'm doing a Ask the Experts on the Synapse side of Spark next week, July 13th, I believe. Lucky for me. Yeah. All right, so other bits and pieces. So the new migration guide for people coming from like I said, moving into dedicated SQL pools. So if you're coming from a traditional warehouse, coming from a previous versions, tells you how to actually get into it, largely from Teradata and Netezza, which it's been a while since I've seen a Netezza implementation. But how you go about doing it, what you need to think about, how you plan that migration. Again, that kind of white paper and kind of a guide for helping you plan that piece of work. Whether you're a consultant doing it for someone else, a contractor learning how to do it, a team doing it internally. Again, these guides are actually quite good, and make sure you don't forget things. That's the main thing. Just kind of, you might have your own plan already. Just step through and go, oh, we hadn't thought about that. Yeah, we need to include those things as well. Super useful stuff. Comments. Yeah, I know. Shouldn't be excited about this, but we do lots of querying of things via Synapse Serverless. And Synapse Serverless is going to convert anything you query into SQL. That's kind of the point. So if you have something that doesn't have data types, it's going to have to explicitly decide the data types, then it made a guess. And in the old days, the guess was, oh, it's a string. I'll just make that the biggest varchar I can. So like varchar thousands everywhere. Now, if you have a load of strings and every single one of them is put into memory as a varchar 1000, that's not the best thing in the world. So they've made it better. It's now far better at guessing and far better inferring columns, especially if you're doing things like converting across from Parquet. Parquet, you get a load of strings. You don't have different sized varchars. So really, really good. Made some updates. You should see generally if you weren't using the with statement, do we have an example of it in this one? Yeah, there we go. So this is what we used to have to do. We used to have a with statement and explicitly say, no, this is a small one. This isn't that big. Don't worry about it. To tell serverless how to understand that particular column. Now, we don't need that. It's just going to figure it out. It's just, we don't need to tell it. We don't need to be as explicit with our with statements because it's going to make some better guesses. So that's good. Definitely helps and speed things up. Another dedicated SQL pool connector. So if you're trying to push data into dedicated SQL pools from Spark, we've had an age-old connector that was available. And we, as it's mentioning, kind of, we had an age-old connector that was fine and it worked and it was good. That was in the before times, before Synapse came along. That was when we had Azure SQL Data Warehouse. And then we had a new Synapse dedicated SQL pool connector that was only available in Scala, which, again, the majority of people using Spark these days tend to use either Python or SQL. So we've seen some stats about it. We see a lot of information coming about how people tend to use Spark these days, and it's not in Scala, really, despite Scala being primary language that Spark's written in. But, it is what it is. So now you can use that in Python, in Spark 3. So that's obviously good. That's going to help. So if you are writing data into dedicated SQL pools from your Spark engine, then, again, you've got that new library. Can do things like AAD authentication, which is great. We don't want to use SQL authentication anywhere. Come on. And again, they've got some examples about how that works. So if you are doing that integration, if you're going, read something in Spark in your lake and you're dumping it into a dedicated SQL pool, have a look at that connector. You should be able to use it in better ways now. Other pieces. So if you're in your Azure Synapse Spark pool and you want to do some Spark config, it's always been a bit of a dark art. It's been a bit of a guessing game what the various different Spark configs are. But you're trying to change the threshold at which it'll auto broadcast a table. Well, you need to know the secret code and then you can set it. That's kind of just the way Spark is. There's tons and tons of environment variables and configurations you can set, but it's quite hard to know what they are. So what the Synapse team have done, they've built a little UI so you can go and say, actually, I want some configuration. And they've got a thing that actually helps you build it, which is really cool. So it'll have some suggestions, it'll have some validation. You won't have to wait until your Spark pool tries to turn on and then falls over and then you go, yeah, that's not a configuration, that doesn't exist. Because none of us have done that before, right? Cool. So that's good. All right, over on the Data Explorer side of the fence. Now, I've not been using that a lot recently, so we'll skim through it, give you an opinion. Don't take me as an expert on the deep depths of Data Explorer. Certainly not recently. Kind of had a quick play when it came out. Number one, the age-old request. You build any shiny data analytics tool, any big data tool, any data visualization tool. Build anything that is shiny and in the cloud and using the latest technology, someone is going to come along and say, can I open it in Excel? So we have an open in Excel option for Synapse Data Explorer. So if you've written a query, if you've kind of got your time series, you've got your various things you want to use for alerting, monitoring, whatever it happens to be, you can run the query. And then once that query is ran, go, open it in Excel, and it'll maintain that connection. It's really useful. So you can pass it along and give it to people and share that thing, and they can even go and refresh it. Again, if you're moving data around, you don't have to take the data out, have it hard-coded, email it to someone, and then they've just got that static cut of the data. You can have a nice live Excel report that they can go and hit refresh, and I'll go back, hit that same query, and bring back updated results, which is super cool, really useful. People are going to ask for it. No matter what you do, no matter what you try, people want to do that. And it's just part of how people work, because Excel is the tool of BI. Okay. We now use managed identities for external SQL Server tables in Data Explorer. And this is very much still a Synapse Data Explorer thing. So when we're defining tables, it gives us some more options about how we can do that. And being able to use the MSI, the Managed Service Identity, just makes it more secure, makes it work better. New Learn module. So one of the things that we've seen a massive investment on from the Synapse team since it came out in preview is just this build up and build up and build up of the Microsoft Learn stuff behind it. Microsoft Learn is their self-paced training. It's the documentation where you can just follow it, and it has guided tutorials, it has little checkpoints, it has little help guides. Really good way of just learning how to use these tools, because they put their hands up and go, you know what? We've got Spark, we've got dedicated SQL pools, we've got serverless, we've got all these different things in there, and they are all different tools with their own nuance, their own different ways of working. So having these learning modules on quite a quick release cadence being pushed out and published to a fairly high quality, it's great. So if you've not played around with Data Explorer and you want to learn it, you can go through. There's now the second of the planned 3 KQL. That's the Custom Query Language modules out there for you to go and practice and play with. Cool. Another one, we have a Data Explorer connector for some of the Power Platform automation elements. Power Automate, Logic Apps, Power Apps. You've now got the GA, so the generally available connector for using Data Explorer. That means you can write a query using Data Explorer on your logs, looking for certain behaviors, certain blips, certain anomalies. You can have that query, and then you can hook it up and say, well, actually, when this kind of result happens, go do something. Go publish a report. Go send an email to a support team going, they should probably do something. Now, there's some basic alerting we can do with that anyway, but actually having it plumbed into your full Power Automate flow just means you can integrate with the rest of the Power Platform. It means you can integrate into your business side of the workflow. It's not just something that lives inside Azure Data Platform. It actually allows you to integrate with a much wider business. So loads of really cool things you can do. It's got some examples about doing it. I never know, is that Power Automate? Yes, Power Automate, Logic Apps. They look the same. They're the same thing, kind of. No offense some people. And then, yeah, you've got various different things that you can do. So you can have your Logic App running a KQL query. You can have the Power Platform running a query and displaying results to the users so they can have it embedded into their apps. All sorts of cool things that you can do. All right. Okay. One of the other things, one of the use cases we've started to see people doing is essentially using Data Explorer. So because it's good at time series, because it's doing like event-based processing, using that as almost kind of a way of processing streams into another place. So going to something like an event hub, grabbing that data and landing it down into a database. Now, the problem is if we've done some processing of that data and then we're landing it down into a database, well, if we need to use that same data at other places, we'd have to have another KQL query with the same repeated logic and then the same repeated logic going to the various different sources, which just means we have to maintain several copies of that logic, which isn't great. Now, we have the ability to specify multiple databases. So we can kind of just take this and say, I would like it to route this data to multiple databases and then push out that. If you are using that as a pattern, if you're using KQL as your processing transformation engine for your stream of data. We can also, so we've had people when they're doing this kind of setup and they're creating Data Explorer databases, you could have it so you could actually provision those databases as part of the ARM template. But yeah, you couldn't really do too much of it. So you've now got some more commands that you can actually do as part of this embedded KQL script inside of an ARM template. Now the actual, what does that mean in terms of what are the use cases? How would you use that? Where would you actually think about using it? Honestly, I don't know. We've not played around and dug into the depths of the use cases about why you'd have that as part of your ARM deployment and creating all these different databases. Obviously, if you're deploying your environment and then you're having things hooked up to those databases and expecting them to exist, they need to be created at runtime. And if they need to be created by ARM templates, then it makes sense to have more flexibility about how you do that. But haven't dug too far into it. Okay, number 2 version of no matter what the user is going to say, can I get it in Excel, please? One of the things that we've actually, it's just so useful, is inside integration pipelines, the data factory monitoring side of things. We've now got this export to CSV button of our monitoring pane. So if you've got your full history of, oh, well, this is the last daily run, you've done some filtering, you've got your full execution run of your various different pipelines and the child pipelines and everything that happened as part of that. And then you're digging around trying to find out how long things took, what would that do, what parameters were there. And loads of people go, can't we just dump it to Excel? Can't we just put it into a CSV and then actually just go and play with it? And yes, you can. There is now a button to say, please export my monitoring information into a CSV. Now, realistically, if you have your diagnostic settings turned on, you should be sending this monitoring data into Log Analytics and then querying it via KQL and doing all that good stuff programmatically and building it into queries and alerts and all that good stuff. But realistically, occasionally people go, oh, I just want to have a play around with it. And that was hard to do. Now it's hard to just pick it up and have a bit of a dig and see what we can do. So just an export CSV button, super useful for just exporting it into a CSV. Kind of makes sense what it does, right? Okay. Incremental data loading be made easier for doing certain sources. Now, I've not even looked at this. So I'm assuming this is using the copy activity. So when we're moving things together, if you're trying to look at things like Azure SQL, Azure Database for Postgres and MySQL, just making that copy just a little bit better to it incrementally. So we'll do an initialization load and then multiple incremental loads afterwards. I'll need to do a video on that and dig into it. I've not actually looked too far into it. Yeah, interesting. It's always good to see those improvements. Essentially, incremental data, not having to program it in, not having to keep all that logic and the high watermarking and all that kind of stuff somewhere in your metadata. Just initialize it and hit go. That makes so much more sense. If it can get hold of that CDC metadata, which it can now do, Synapse SQL, Azure Database for Postgres and MySQL. All right, UDFs for mapping data flows. So again, if you have several different mapping data flows, it's quite likely you'd add the same derived column to everything. If I was doing it to ingest data, and I had 20 different tables I was ingesting into my lake, and I wanted to add some auditing columns, a bit of lineage, a bit of general information, I'd have to have add derived column and put the logic in every single mapping data flow, and it's a painful experience. So actually now saying we can have these user-defined functions, we can predefine certain function and just call that central bit of logic, and then we can go manage that as a library. We can go and update it if our logic changes. It's just good practice. So yeah, super useful. We can now build these functions in, and then we can plug it into our data flows. Not had any look in terms of performance and how it works and how it's actually implemented. Is it just a snippet of code and then it plugs it in the same as everything else? Is it doing something else a bit funky? Don't know yet. Another one, we've got assertion error handling. Assert error handling. There we go, words. So we saw in previous months, we've had the assertions come into mapping data flows. That's when it's saying, I assert that this value is never greater than this value. This value can't be null. Like of our great expectations style data expectations. I'm saying I'm asserting this value can be true on a particular record, and a record can fail that. So a record, that one's failed these assertions. What do you want to do with it? So having error handling, meaning we can now actually build in rules. We can say, well, if it failed, I want you to include. If it failed, I want you to filter that row out. If it failed, I want you to take it to a separate file and do a quarantine style error handling. Then we can pull them back in. Again, we can then manage that. It's very cool. Another one, a little bit of usability. So when you're inside mapping data flows and you hook it up to a source data, it'll automatically read your source data and give you projections. It will say, well, here are all the different columns and the different types I'm expecting based on the files that you've pointed me at. Now we can just go click edit and then actually edit it in situ, which is just a lot easier than having to have a separate step, which then changes all the things and just like bloats the various number of steps we're going through in the mapping data flow. Being able to edit the projection directly in source is quite nice. Easy. Click a button, play around with it. All good. And then the final piece, which I'm not going to go into heavily, because again, we did talk about it in the build announcements, is Synapse Link for SQL. So again, that's if you have SQL Server 2022 or you have Azure SQL Database and you want to actually maintain that HTAP style thing, that hybrid transactional analytical processing, is essentially saying, I want to run analytical queries directly on my OLTP, but directly on my transactional database. And it does this in different ways. So we've seen Cosmos DB, we've got Synapse Link, and that creates its own little analytical data store that's invisible that we think we're querying Cosmos DB. Actually, we're querying basically Parquet files or column store files in the lake. In this case, we're actually going to see more replicated push of data over into Synapse itself, and then we can query that. So lots of different ways we can do it. There might be some limitations in it. We'll have a look at that in a future video. But again, watch the video, watch the build recap, and you can catch up with where that is. Oh, okay, so that was casting our mind back a whole month to the end of May and what we saw actually pushed out there. Loads of things happening, quite a big push on Data Explorer, and yeah. Fast forward. All right, this is a bit more relevant. So we're now in 7th of July. So these are the updates that actually were pushed out during the month of June. And again, we've got another video from Ryan. Again, this time he got the green shirt memo, so it's very, very good. Talking about a few other things. Now, the first thing on this list, actually the second thing on this list, the second thing I'm quite excited about. The first thing, I love it. Makes no sense, but I love it. So first thing is, there is now a sample solution that you can download and have a play with using orbital analytics data. So essentially, this is from Azure Space, bringing out kind of not spatial analytics, not geospatial analytics, which, you know, makes sense because it's geo, it's on Earth. This is spatial from space. And it's a really good example of actually doing geospatial analytics and using geospatial data types, plugging into some of the geospatial cognitive services, and getting all that stuff, which is really, really cool. It's a really interesting use case to have a look at, see how it all plugs together, see how a use case for working with geospatial data that you can then take and apply to more pedestrian, down on the ground geospatial use cases. But actually, it's also just really interesting to see what they're doing in terms of Azure Space. Azure Space is a thing. You can see the various things that they're doing for spaceborne data analysis. But yeah, just as a kind of a fairly more complex, fairly more kind of in-depth sample of how to do interesting stuff. Loads of things to go and have a look at. Now, another one, which is super interesting for me as a consultant going out working with lots of different clients, is the Success by Design white papers. So if I just go and dive into this, essentially, it's just a white paper guide about how to run a POC, how to choose who your audience are, how to decide what an effective POC is. If we dive into the Spark one, it will actually, how to identify the various sponsors, how to decide what data you're using, how to set the goals, how do you measure the success of a proof of concept after the fact, questions to ask yourself as you're going through it, how do you plan the project and then measure success, how do you test success at the end of your POC, and just general steps to go through. So yeah, super useful just as a free resource out there for anyone running a POC project, be you a consultant or a contractor or, again, an internal kind of team running a project, trying to work out if this is the right stuff for you. And actually, having ran through it, I mean, that is just a generally good workflow for running a POC, regardless of the technology. So yeah, definitely a nice resource that's been pushed out as part of the Synapse. Okay, other bits and pieces. So looking at the maximum query result set, got up from 200 gig to 400 gig. So those people who are sitting there going, return the biggest result, select star, I want it coming back to Management Studio, give me everything. Well, you now can. So they're making that bigger. Again, don't forget you're paying by data red. So the more data you're returning, the more you're going to pay for it. You go nuts. Why not? Okay, I've got new areas when working with KQL. Kind of there's a whole new data explorer place. Kind of, again, getting people more on board with it, making it a bit more accessible, giving you the sample gallery so you can go and have a play with various different KQL examples. Again, there's a real focus on, I guess, kind of making it. A lot of people saw Data Explorer and went, what is that? Log analysis, time series analysis. It's not for me. And it's just loads of things just to push it and go, it's not actually that scary. It's actually really easy to use. And it's actually very, very powerful because actually most people have log information. Most people actually are starting to see IoT use cases, real-time streams of data, things that they could do with querying. Okay, we've got some more bits. Again, the kind of the visualizations within the KQL parts is getting better. And have a play with that stuff. And we can even set time zones. We can actually, again, lots of settings, having to play around, making the in-browser experience just that little bit better within Synapse stuff. All nice, all good, all useful. I'm pretty sure that is not just for Data Explorer. I think that's just generally for anything. Your visualizations are a little bit better and your time zones are a little bit more figurable. All right. Over on the mapping data flows side of things, some more integration stuff. We have fuzzy joins. This takes me back. I haven't used a GUI fuzzy join since the days of SSIS and doing that for clients trying to do master data management and find a single version of the truth, find a single version of that client. Loads and loads and loads of use cases where fuzzy joins come in. This is when we're saying, I want to take two data sets. I want to look from this data set. I want to join it to another data set. but the keys aren't going to be exactly the same. I'm not going from one key to another key. I'm giving it two strings and saying where the strings are a bit similar, kind of similar, very similar, and that's configurable to me. So I might be saying names. We're saying, well, the name's going to be the same, but it might be Simon. It might be Simon with a lowercase. I might just call myself Cy. It might just be S dot. And instead of saying, is that the same person? Is it similar? And you're trying to do that mapping based on an element of confidence. Because you've got different join types in here. We have, yes, I want this to be fuzzy. And then we get a similarity threshold. How close should it be? Like 100% is going, this has to be the exact same thing. 90% maybe capitalization's okay, maybe an odd space. 80%, actually maybe they're different words. Is it Simon? Is it Steve? They could be very similar things, but actually they're not the same word. You can have a play around with that, and you can have a look at the effect of the different similarity thresholds. Work out, is it bringing back false positives? Is it saying, well, actually, I think these are the same? You're like, no, that's not the same, because you've got your similarity threshold set too low, too high, and you're like, no, there's nothing in there. There's no joins. I don't know how it's joining. We've got various different ways of doing that. Now, fuzzy joins, you can go deep into doing it. You might have several paths. You might do several passes. You might say, right, join based on this key to this key. They have to be exact. Now, anything we didn't find, then do a fairly confident fuzzy match. Anything we didn't find via our confident fuzzy match, then do an even less confident match. And it's not just saying there's one fuzzy join. We normally end up with several processes trying to carve out as much accuracy as we can, and then marking it as, well, these ones are accurate, these ones are less accurate, these ones are, it's just a guess, it's a stab in the dark, honestly. But still, a useful thing to be able to do. Okay, map data. So we've got the map data tool. So this is the thing that sits inside of our lake database designer. So when we've got that whole tool, when we go into Synapse, we create a lake database and we say, oh, I'd like to design it. And it opens up a lake designer. And now that's a place where we can import the tools. We can import the industry template and say, I want the retail model and the 1,000 tables that are part of it. Or I can design my tables and say, I want a new table. This is the name. This is the key. Here's all the columns. And now we've got this button saying map data, which will then actually spin up a little mapping data flows kind of thing that lets us say, we'll take data from there. I want to put it into that table, and it'll basically design a data flow for us, take data from our source and map it into those tables. Essentially, it's going from table design back to the source as in order to kind of work out how to get there, kind of almost reverse engineering how to get there, as opposed to most ETL that we're doing these days, where we start at the source and we slowly incrementally build up to the intended design. So super useful, interesting, some limitations still in terms of the type of data and what can go into a lake database, but still an interesting tool and a really good way of exposing data manipulation to your citizen developers, your citizen ETL data modelers. Model the data, map it, and then via the GUI, design how they want to pull that from an existing layer of curated tables. And I think finally, oh no, there's more stuff. Okay. So we can now rerun pipelines with new parameters. So one of the things that we've had inside integration pipelines is it'll fail, and it can fail partway through a thing, and I can go restart from there, restart from that task, or rerun that whole pipeline. But I couldn't rerun it with different parameters. I couldn't rerun it with an override. So super, super useful, and lots of different things we can do in here. So we can have it monitored as a rerun. We can compare its results against the previous run, even though I'm passing different parameters. I don't have to start from the beginning with a different parameter set and try and watch if it gets past where it failed last time. I can simply go, rerun, here's your new parameter. And if you design all your pipelines with overrides, with additional parameters, with additional settings you can turn on, maybe to do a bit more debugging. So if something fails, and you go, run it again with the same parameters, add an additional parameter that's my debug, that's verbose, that's going to spit out a load of stuff, that'll help me understand it. Loads of things we can do because we can now restart with different parameters, which is cool. Okay, those user-defined functions we talked about earlier in this thing have now gone generally available. So it's a very, very quick switch going from it's there now to its GA, so you can use those. And then a deep and dirty interesting one is the rollout of essentially GPU accelerated machine learning to the Spark pools. That's always an interesting one, saying, well, actually, I want to switch. I want to use GPUs to do any kind of workload. Generally, they're very good for distributed deep learning. Deep learning, the kind of things where we're doing hundreds, thousands of CPU cycles when we're processing data. It's less like the traditional data task where we're saying, right, take this big chunky amount of data and do a few tasks to it. We're saying, well, actually take maybe a smaller amount of data and just do thousands and thousands of cycles and attempts and trials to try and work something out. What we're doing in terms of a lot of our deep learning training processes. So that's a thing. GPU accelerated pools, that's fine. But then saying your various different tools that run on a GPU that really take advantage of your GPU drivers, you tend to have to use a special kind of machine learning model. Now we're talking PyTorch, we're talking TensorFlow, various different models that are actually really good at doing that kind of deep learning. But they don't natively scale. They don't understand how to work across 3, 4, 5, 10, 200 Spark workers. If you try and run it, it's just going to run on the driver or on a single worker, and that's not going to be any good whatsoever. So you have various different kind of frameworks that you can run on Spark that will actually take a distributed deep learning model and then just spread it, that distribute it over workers. And that's what Horovod and Pedestorm are. They are handlers for things like PyTorch and TensorFlow that actually you can run it using the Horovod distributor. And then that will actually take that and spread it and go, right, you worker, you're going to train, you're going to use that and give us your partial results. You're going to do that and train on that. You're going to do that. And it spreads out the workload so you can distribute this big, chunky training workload, especially if we're dealing with a lot of data. And you don't always see it that often because you need to have quite a lot of data for it to be worth distributing something like a deep learning training model. But it is commonly done. It is a big thing. And it's a real nice thing that we can now do that inside the Synapse Spark pools. So again, it is in public preview, so don't use it in production. You take it with a pinch of salt, it might break. This is also available in other Spark providers. So this is a good thing for the Synapse Spark pools to be catching up and be able to do the same thing that you've been able to do in other managed Spark platforms for a while. And it's just kind of getting that maturity in the Spark pools to be able to do stuff like running Horovod, to be plugging in our GPU accelerated worker nodes and doing all that stuff. So yeah, very cool. Really, really good, interesting stuff. Oh, okay, that was a beast. Yeah, no, lots and lots and lots of things happening in those 2 months. So again, quick recap. Really, really good white papers for migrating into dedicated secret pools or just running a POC on any part of Synapse. Definitely go and have a look at those white papers. Super useful to do that kind of thing. Big updates on the Data Explorer side of things. Loads of things trying to open up accessibility and get people working with it. Loads of things on the Data Explorer, on the data integration pipelines side of things, largely in mapping data flows and what we're seeing in terms of more and more functionality and reusability and kind of engineering going into those mapping data flow bits of functionality, and a couple of updates on the Sparky side just to keep me happy. There we go. Whoa. So, yes, I know that was a beast of a video. I know there was a huge amount of stuff in there. As always, go and check out the actual release note and go and have a look through the details. Tons of stuff in the documentation and the Microsoft Learn sites and the extra tutorials and samples and blogs and things to accompany it. Go and look at that stuff. If you're using any of these bits and pieces and what I said made no sense whatsoever, go and have a look at the actual docs and you'll be good. And with that, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let me know which of that myriad features are the things that you actually care about that you think, oh no, that's good. That's really important. Until then, I'll see you next time. Cheers.